Foundations of American Government. Chapter 1, talking about principles of government. Now, it's important when we talk about our government, not only are we looking at the philosophers that we have already talked about, but we're also going to be looking at different documents, where our founding fathers got their ideas from, etc. Now, before we actually begin this section, I have a question for you. What would life be like if, from an early age, you had been free to do whatever you wanted without any parental control? Now, many of you, when I asked this in class, a lot of you guys said that you'd probably be dead or face down in a gutter, or some people would say fun, wild, and free, or whatever. But in reality, having parents would mean no guidelines. And no guidelines would mean your moral code and your ethics, and learning how to do things would be corrupt. So that's an important thing to note when we're talking about government, is government provides structure, consistency. We crave these things as human beings. So remember that as we go through these sections, is that think about if our government is consistent. Is it necessary? Is it structured? Those are all things that build into how our government is being run. Now, what is government? Our first definition is the institution through which a society makes and enforces its public policies, or the formal institutions through which land and its people are ruled. Now, either definition works for our purposes, and one comes from your textbook that we use in class, and the other is from another textbook on the bookshelf. And I'd be happy to provide those references to you if you need them. Okay, but that is what government is. Now, there's three basic powers of government, and you're familiar with them. First, we have the legislative power to make laws. You have the executive power to execute, enforce, and administer laws. And judicial power to interpret laws. Okay, our judicial branch looks at what 1 and 2 do and compare it to our Constitution. And most of the time, they'll either apply the law, whether it's a crime or a civil suit or what have you. They'll look at the different actions and decide if it's constitutional or not. If it's not constitutional, they will strike it down. Public policy, another important definition. Public policy is as follows: a law, rule, statute, or edict that expresses the government's goals, provides for rewards and punishments to promote their attainment. One of the most common examples is prison time for certain offenses. You know that if you steal and are caught, which most likely you will be sent to prison or pay a fine or have community service. You know that there is a result or consequence for your actions. It just is a matter of how terrible or how massive your offense is. Now, constitutions, we're not talking about our constitution, we're talking about constitutions in general. What are they? Okay. They outline the powers given to a country's government. They're also known as a body of fundamental laws, and sets formal and effective limits on the power of government. All three of these things constitutions do, which is super interesting if you think that a piece of paper can actually dictate what a country does. It's not just a piece of paper, but it's the meaning behind that paper. Okay. Now, government versus politics. Politics is a process. It is not the same thing. Okay. Government is an institution. Politics is a process by which a society decides how power and resources will be distributed through the government. Okay. Politics is using the institution of government to decide how things are going to be distributed across the population. It's important to remember that. Politics is a process, government is an institution. Now, politics themselves, okay? Politics in and of itself, before you add man into it per se, is neither good nor bad, but it should be necessary for things getting done. But governments can be made without it. Would I advise that you don't have politics? No. Typically, if you don't have politics occurring in your government, it means that your government is a dictatorship and not functioning appropriately. Politics helps not only the government decide who gets what, but you're seeing influence, you're seeing priorities. And if there's no politics being used, or the process is not happening, then we don't know what the government is truly valuing unless it tells you. Okay. Now the state. Body of people living in a defined territory, organized politically, aka government, and with power to make and enforce law without the consent of any higher governing authority. Sovereignty, absolute and supreme power, okay, within a territory. Now the four characteristics: population, territory, sovereignty, and government. Okay, you will see those again probably on the review, which is tomorrow, which is Wednesday and Thursday for second period, 5th, 6th, and 7th periods. So if you're watching this now, you might want to note what you're looking at. Now the state continued. State is a legal term. Remember that. Okay, the state of Israel, state of California. It's often called a nation or country, but a nation is an ethnic term and country is a geographical term. Okay, just make sure you're aware of the differences. So when you hear people say nation or country, depending on what the context is, you can say, okay, is that talking about ethnic or are you talking about geographical? Because there's a difference. Now, population is one of the first characteristics we're looking at. Population may be homogeneous or not, meaning heterogeneous. Homogeneous is a group of people who share customs, a common language, and ethnic backgrounds. Now, the majority of the U.S. population, we share a common language. We share some customs like Thanksgiving, Christmas, 4th of July, but we have different ethnic backgrounds. Okay, you can look at the Bay Area in general, you'll see all kinds of different stuff happening all the time. Different cultural festivals. You have a Greek festival coming up. You have, celebration of Japantown, Chinatown, all kinds of different stuff. We have different customs and ethnic backgrounds, but we do predominantly share a common language, even though it's not explicitly American English. Most people associate English as the official language of the United States. Now, the U.S. currently has 318.9 million people, as according to the last census taken. I'm sure it's much more than that now. You have California, 38.8 million people. And Contra Costa County, 1.094 million. Okay, here's a cute little picture of Contra Costa County. For all of those you remember, we have this little section here that, maybe ethnically speaking does not match with this, but it's all about a balance of services in this point. Okay. Territory, our second one. Also known as land. Okay, that's very simple. And territory is land. Typically has recognized borders. Now, the United States, we have a northern border and a southern border. One is more protected than the other because this has more of a natural background or whatever it may be, but we'll move on. Sovereignty. Okay, every nation state has supreme and absolute power within its own territory and can decide its own foreign and domestic policies. These states are neither subordinate nor responsible to any other authority. Okay, the United States of America is a sovereign nation. The United States is sovereign, but the states that make up the U.S. are not. Okay, each state is subordinate to the Constitution of the United States. Okay, the Constitution has set up 3 branches: legislative, executive, and judicial. With those being there, the states have to answer. Okay, they have Amendment 10, which is the Reserve Powers Clause, and we'll get into that probably either next week or the week after. But note that each state is subordinate, and the federal government simply chooses when to pick a fight with the state government and when not to. Now, government. Is it necessary? It is if you want to avoid chaos and destruction and early death. Okay? Remember what Thomas Hobbes said. Without government, continual fear and danger of violent death in life would be solitary, poor, nasty, brutish, and short. So we're looking at the idea that government helps provide structure, provides security of persons, of property, etc. And so it's important that government is there to provide law and order. Now, some recent examples of where law and order has been suspended: Lebanon, Syria, Bosnia, Somalia, South Sudan, parts of Ukraine, Crimea. There's plenty of places in the world right now that are experiencing a lack of a functioning government, which is terrifying, but we as Americans really can't fathom it because we do not live in those situations. And there's Thomas Hobbes right there in the corner, looking like T. Hobbes. Now, review of some major political ideas. First and foremost, The force theory. The state was born out of force. One person or a small group claimed control over an area and forced all within it to submit to his or her rule. They took it by force. Okay? That's probably the easiest one to remember. Then you have the evolutionary theory. The state developed naturally out of the early family. Now, the early family had a mom, dad, and usually the kids. The mom usually kind of set up the rules, dad enforced them. Okay? And the kids followed. Obviously, in 2016, things have changed, but remember, this is an older theory. They're simply saying the state developed out of that patriarchy that we see in a traditional family structure. Divine right theory holds that God created the state, and that God, had given those of royal birth a divine right to rule. The divine right theory. You've been blessed by God with that position. And finally, the social contract theory, which you're familiar with. The state arose out of a voluntary act of free people, and the state exists to serve the will of the people. Remember, popular sovereignty, limited government, and individual rights are promoted in this theory. Now, the purposes of government. There are 6 of them, and they're found in the preamble of the Constitution. First, to form a more perfect union, unity. Okay? All the states may work together as a part of a strong, united nation. Historical note, remember, the United States had just won the war for independence, and the 13 colonies had agreed to loosely unite under the Articles of Confederation. Unfortunately, the Articles proved to be ineffective in uniting the colonies, which we have seen today when we talked about the Articles of Confederation's shortcomings. The Constitution was adopted by the states and the American people, promoting a closer unity. Now, establishing justice. That's number 2. And there's Lady Justice right above. Okay. Justice is not an invention of the human mind. We talked about Plato's justice, talked about Aristotle's. But where do we see an accurate picture of justice? If you look up Isaiah 61 verses 8 and 9, you will see a picture of accurate justice. Laws of man, so human law, must be responsible, fair, and impartial. And due to the history of this country and current events, you can think of what Dallas, Baton Rouge, Michigan, all those different places, okay? It is obvious that we are continually attempting to reach the goal of fairness and establishing true justice, but we as humans are inherently flawed. And it might take longer than we would think to achieve fairness, but in reality, will things ever be fair? Probably not. Sorry to be the Debbie Downer again. Ensure domestic tranquility. There will be peace within the nation. So government is providing law and order to avoid anarchy. We don't need all kinds of protesting 100% of the time. We do need structure. Federalist 51 by James Madison. If men were angels, no government would be necessary. And that harkens back to Romans 3:23. Okay? But remember, domestic tranquility. You want peace. You want people to at least work side by side in harmony. Even if you disagree with the individual beside you, you can still work together towards a common goal of success. Provide for the common defense. Okay? Yay, Department of Defense. The nation will be safe from attack. No duh, right? But it's important to they put this in the preamble so everyone would understand that they're going to still work together from the American Revolutionary War onward, that they're still going to work together to protect each other. The U.S. has the most powerful armed forces in the world, but they must remain vigilant in light of new threats arising daily, both foreign and domestic. Okay, there's domestic terrorism and foreign terrorism, and we'll get into those differences later on in this semester. Currently, we spend about $618 billion on our defense. And then, hilariously enough, China, Russia, Saudi Arabia, France, UK, India, and Germany combined spend about $601 billion, roughly. Now, number 5, promote the general welfare. Okay, that sounded weird. My apologies. Promote the happiness and well-being of all the people. Okay, you're trying to have a high quality of living within your state or government. Okay, within your society. Government can create programs to protect and ensure the health of its citizens. I give the example of public school systems, government regulations on water and air quality, but you can also talk about fire department, police, EMTs, certain services that come out and map where the power lines are, so you don't dig and hit a power line and electrocute yourself or start a fire or knock out power for everybody else. Okay, but having regulations on water and air quality are super important. If we did not have those things, we'd be drinking very dirty water and breathing in very dirty air. And so those are some good government regulations. They are promoting the general welfare. People with asthma thank the government for having some air quality control. Now, I say major private corporations exist in the United States because some private corporations exist out of the United States and still perform and carry out stuff. But the ones that are in the United States, they carry out certain activities that other foreign governments might control. Okay? So, U.S. Steel, GE, ExxonMobil, they're all owned outside the United States, but they still perform things inside the United States. For example, U.S. Steel is no longer owned by a U.S. company. It's actually owned by South Korea. But U.S. Steel still promotes and has community activities in the United States to promote community wellness of where their stuff is taking place. Same thing with GE and ExxonMobil. They all have different community events, community service stuff that benefits the United States communities. Secure the blessings of liberty. Okay? Give me liberty, give me death. Make sure that our children are collectively, even if you don't end up having kids, you think of the future, okay? Children and grandchildren will enjoy the same freedoms that we do. So we want to make sure that we're passing down the same liberties and rights that we have experienced. Liberty now is a relative term. No one is free to do whatever he or she pleases, for whatever that individual attempts to do could interfere with the freedoms of others. So you only have freedom to the point where you interfere with somebody else. There's only so much freedom one can have. Okay? Now, patriotism fuels our need to protect rights and liberties. We desire to protect. The minute you start to threaten a right or an amendment or a liberty, patriotism comes into full swing, and we start thinking like USA, USA, even though perhaps you're just looking at one right. So, like, for example, the Second Amendment, always associated with the whole chanting of the United States, right? So that's just one example, but we want to secure the blessings. We want to be able to pass on the freedom of speech and religion, the right to due process, trial by jury, etc. Now, we already did this close-up earlier this year, but remember John Locke profoundly influenced America's founders. Locke argued that governments need the consent of the people. John Locke did put forth 4 rights: life, liberty, property, and revolution. You will hear those over and over again. And do these ideas seem familiar? Of course they do. These ideas were started in Scripture, Exodus 20 and Genesis 1 through 3. Now, at the end of this PowerPoint, you're thinking to yourself, now what? Now I would say go listen to sections 2 and 3. Thank you for listening to chapter 1, section 1.